had they listened to Nobel or Churchill at the time, we might have had a 20th century in which communism never appears. What Lenin and Stalin and the Bolsheviks did to Nobel at the time of the Russian Revolution was the inspiration for George Orwell's 1984. They completely erased his history. He can never relinquish power because then he'll be too vulnerable and almost certainly be assassinated by someone who then absorbs the power. Like the minute he lets go of the power, someone will take him out. So he has to stay in there until the very end. Napoleon would say that, sometimes you're the lamb, sometimes you're the lion. And he was basically saying to his son, that's fine for Western Europe, that doesn't work in Russia. In Russia, you can be only the lion.
My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Today's conversation is with Douglas Brunt. He has lived several different lives, CEO of a cybersecurity company, novelist, historical researcher, and host of conversations with some of the most successful writers in the country. His work often returns to the same question: what do powerful people hide from themselves? And what gets lost when the official story becomes the accepted story? This is not just a conversation about books or history. It is about ambition, pressure, and the cost of leaving one life behind to build another. Doug, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me here. This is great.
Yeah, I like the intro already. I'm ready to go.
Yeah.
You were running a cybersecurity company when you started writing seriously. What was happening in your life when writing became more than something you did on the side?
When I used to, as you say, I was running a cybersecurity firm. It was based in Florida, but I was living in New York, and I was traveling back and forth quite a bit. And my wife and I had one kid, one on the way. And so life was a little hectic with that amount of travel. So I really was gone like sort of Monday to Thursday, just about every week. And we had taken this vacation where we went to the Bahamas, and I read The Gold Coast by Nelson DeMille, who I love, just a terrific writer. And I finished that book and I put it down at the end of the vacation thinking to myself, I want to make people feel the way this book made me feel. And I started hobbying around with a novel, and I would write it on planes and, just in all of the downtime of all the travel. But still not, I didn't know anyone who's a writer. It hadn't really occurred to me that was a way to make a living in a way. I mean, of course, I knew that some people did, but I didn't know anyone who did that. And so it was really just a way to pass the time because I was always a huge reader. But, for this period of time, instead of reading, I was writing to relax. And then I finished it and I showed it to my wife. She said, this is actually pretty good. It's like I actually enjoyed this book. So it wasn't this humiliating moment in the marriage. And so I had grown increasingly frustrated with the day job of running this company. There's for a whole other show worth of reasons. And I sold the company and then found an agent and then a publishing deal with Simon & Schuster for what became my first novel. It was that manuscript that I wrote after that vacation of reading DeMille. And then the funny full circle piece of that is that book had been out and it did okay. And I got invited to a couple different literary festival type things. And one was hosted by Nelson DeMille at the Union League Club in New York. And I was like, I'm absolutely going. I might actually meet Nelson DeMille at this thing. And so I went and I did meet him. We ended up having a bunch of scotch by the bar. And I told him the whole story about how I got going. And it was his book that kind of sent me off on the mission. And he and I actually just framed, he passed away, but he sent me this really nice letter once. And I just framed it. It's at the framers right now, actually. And I'm going to keep it in my office where he gave me some advice on the publishing business and agents and stuff like that. And he was a great guy. But so my life was new kids, frustrating job, and kind of took a leap into writing, which became the first novel. And then I have written 3 novels, but really am now very much in this narrative history track. So nonfiction, like Eric Larson style of books, as you know.
So when you were younger, reading all the time, did you ever have dreams of being an author when you grew up, or no?
Fantasy, in the same way that you dream to win Wimbledon or the heavyweight championship boxing belt or something like that. Never applied dreams, just sort of crazy weird dreams.
Yeah.
But I always was a huge reader. It started off with Frog and Toad, into Hardy Boys, into Tolkien. Robert Ludlum, I was a huge fan of, and then, Hemingway and all the rest. But I actually kind of read almost in like, I kind of stick with one author for at least a few books. I'll get sort of really into one writer and then grab a few books by that person. So
It's funny because a lot of those you mentioned, my dad always talks about how he loved, like Hardy Boys specifically is one that I don't know how many times I've heard him promote the Hardy Boys books to young boy readers. And
did you end up reading it? Because I've tried with my kids, and they don't. They're younger than you are, but they never really took to Hardy Boys.
I know it didn't get me the way it got you and him, but you guys are both authors, distinguished authors now, and I'm certainly not. So maybe there's something to that.
Franklin W. Dixon, even though that's probably like 20 different people, but
It's funny because like my dad talks about, because he's an author and 40 plus books and all that, and people always say to him like, hey, what's your advice, what would you tell me as a young person getting started, or I had dreams one day being an author, and he just says the same thing: read nonstop.
yep, yep.
Now
Got to be a reader.
it's not just reading
And
anything, you have to read Hardy Boys. It's the only way to get it done.
that's the secret. If you only knew, Hardy Boys is the actual thing you need to read. Yeah, and right. The other key is to actually put pen to paper, which so few people do. Just the sort of working the muscle of writing, whether it's a diary entry or a poem or a bit of a few pages on the pile of the book, but try to write every day.
You know something I'm curious about, Doug? If your wife had said, if she had just been honest with you and said, you know what, I don't love it, but it's fun to do, but I don't really love the story. Would you have pursued it the way you did, or did she give you kind of the spark?
That's it. No one's ever actually asked that question before. I think that could have been the end of it. There's a good chance that it would have stopped right there, because she is unsparing in her feedback, and whether it's good or bad, and she's a pretty good judge of material. So if she had just spiked it, that it could have just stopped right there.
I love, there's always these moments, it seems like, when we're talking to people on a podcast, or if you'd really talk to anybody, there's always like these moments in people's lives that there's two people having an exchange, and it's such a like minor thing to one party, and it's like a life-changing moment to the other. There's this one that's just sticking out in my head. We had Stephen Curtis Chapman on, the musician, and he was they were at some music festival, and he was singing like in a background role, and the judge heard him, and they ended up, their like band didn't get picked, but the guy's like, hey, can you just try singing as the lead, which he'd never done before. He's like, I don't have the voice for it, whatever. Long story short, he ends up becoming one of the most successful country singers of all time, and the Grand Ole Opry, all that stuff. And to that judge, he could have just said nothing. He could have just said, yeah, you guys don't make it, and moved on. And instead, it's this, the judge probably doesn't even remember it, but it's this pivotal moment in his life. Maybe not as exaggerated, because it's your wife, and she's probably being a little more supportive, and she has to live with you. But it's like, to her, she could have easily said like, it's all right. And maybe you're, not on this path.
Yeah, to that story, there was some advice that I got about writing, and it's obvious advice. I was talking to this guy. He's actually a songwriter named Brian Russell. He's married to Cheryl Ladd, who was one of the Charlie's Angels, and we were at a benefit, and it was in that moment right after I read the DeMille book, and I was getting started, and I was kind of struggling to get started. And he was at the bar, and he had like a gin and tonic or something, and he's like, just start writing. And then he slammed the gin and tonic and like walked off as though it was nothing. But I was like dumbstruck. I'm like, just like tomorrow morning, I'm going to start writing. And it's advice I've probably heard 1,000 times, but never absorbed for whatever reason. But in that moment, I was ready to hear it or whatever. And I did start writing the next day. And so I told him about it later, like a year later. I'm like, when you told me to just start writing, quote unquote, I did. Like, I took your advice. He had no memory of any of it. He was off for like 5 more gin and tonics. It meant nothing to him, but it was such a moment for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then I got to ask this too, just because you said you're framing it. If there was a young aspiring author, what's in the letter that what part of the letter could you share, I guess, as advice from him?
I mean, those are the two big pieces: read and write. You gotta be a huge reader, and you've got to love literature and just kind of even love being around books. I mean, you can see some of them behind me. I've got shelves of books all over the place, and I like the feel of them, like the smell of the glue and the binding, like old books. I just sort of love being surrounded by it all. But those would be the two things. You've got to read and you've got to actually enjoy writing. I think the other piece of enjoying writing that goes along with that is, and this isn't advice to do. I think you're either that way or you're not, but you need to enjoy your alone time, because it is a solitary thing. And for me, when I'm going into my office to write, I can't wait to get in the chair and do it. I look forward to. A lot of people, procrastinate, or they don't really sort of run to that time. But I do. I love it. And I think if you're the kind of person that embraces your alone time and enjoys, creating while you're alone, then it could work out.
That leap became real pretty quickly. When you were CEO of Authentium, was there a moment when you realized the job was taking more from you than you wanted to admit?
Yes, there was a sort of a long-term thing, but if I had to point to one moment where it really hit home, it was in a walk in Central Park with our first child in a stroller, my wife and I doing kind of a loop in New York City Central Park, where we had sort of a family decision because it was going to be a big leap for the family. My wife is successful now, but at the time, neither one of us was like, making gobs of money. So if I was going to take this leap professionally from one career into a totally unknown new career, that was a team decision to make. And so we were talking about how frustrated I'd become with the job as CEO of Authentium, which is a cybersecurity company, with all the travel and sort of really grinding work, and yet had this dream that was actually now becoming not just like the kid I'm going to win Wimbledon dream. It was like, hey, maybe this actually could happen. Maybe we could try this for real. And so we had that walk, and she's like, let's do it. Let's try it. Like, who cares? It might not work out, but it might. And you're not happy with this other. That's clear. Like, I really was very frustrated with it. So, as a team, we kind of said, let's give this a shot. So that would have been like 2010 or so, 2000, right around there.
You sold the company and walked away from that world. What did that decision cost you personally?
The biggest shift in moving from the business world to writing full time was like a social shift. There were aspects of that job, as frustrated as I had become with it, there were parts of it that I absolutely loved. The entrepreneurship side of it, coming in to the office every day and, writing a new page for the company future, and working with my team and investors and customers. And, the day is kind of scheduled out by the half hour. And that was fun. It was dynamic. And I'm not like a wild extrovert, but I'm not a totally solitary person either. And so when I shifted to writing and it became very solitary, there was a real absence for me of social connection. And I tried to fill that over time. Meeting Nelson DeMille at that one event, that sort of thing happened a fair amount. So after a couple of years of writing, I'd come to know a number of different writers. And I was living in New York City at the time too, and many are in New York City. And so it was easier to network with people, I guess. Writers are not naturally networkers at all. So I was sort of a strange anomaly, like, hey, let's get a drink. And everyone's like, wait, what? I just sit in my office all day. And so I had this idea to create a sort of like an author book club. Initially, we're just going to get together at my apartment once a month for some drinks and talking. And then I said, well, let's make it a book club too. We'll sort of have some hook to the get together, and we'll take turns picking a book. We'll all read it. We'll discuss the book. So we ended up doing that. First hour is really just drinking and telling stories of agents and other publisher stories and whatever else was going on in our lives. And then we discussed whatever book that someone had picked that month. And it was just other writers coming together. And so that was a good way for me to fill the pieces of my prior career that I had actually enjoyed, and to, get into a writing lifestyle that was slightly less solitary. But it was terrific. I ended up, we ended up adding a few new members, and some writers knew other writers who were like, wow, that sounds amazing. I'd love to join. And so we ended up getting a group of about 12 writers who are names you would know. I mean, it was like Lee Child and Nelson DeMille and Harlan Coben and some others who were in there. And it was a lot of fun. COVID kind of blew the whole thing up, and then I moved to Connecticut. But it was fun for several years while it lasted.
It seems like it'd be like almost intimidating to talk about a book with all those authors, right? And you don't want to sound like that guy.
Yeah, well, I mean, they definitely have sold way more books than I have, and so there was a range of writers in there, and everyone brought really interesting perspective to the conversations. But certainly, you're looking around, it's like, well, that guy sold about 100 million books. That person sold, a few 100,000. So there was a range of commercial success in the room for sure.
Megan saw what the corporate world was doing to you before you fully stepped away. What did she see that you were not seeing?
I think, I think the main thing that she was seeing and that made her feel good about encouraging me to step away was just, I was feeling very burned out and frustrated and feeling very motivated by the idea of writing. I mean, whenever she sees me in my downtime, she sees me with my nose in a book reading. And then when she saw me writing the first draft of my own novel, how excited I was to do that I would put everything aside and block out time to go sit in a room and write, and how energized I felt by that. So I think she was really just encouraging me to shift to something that she could see was going to make me a lot happier.
That tension shows up in your fiction too. Your first novel looked at Wall Street and the damage caused by money, status, and ambition. What did you learn from that? And did you see any of it in yourself?
One of the things that I've seen Elon Musk point out is show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes, which is a line that's similar that's in my book. If they're going to compensate people, if they're going to compensate volume, then people are going to give you volume. The whole book, Goes with Manhattan, explores the credit default swap crisis that we had in 07, 08, where these traders were packaging together these, very low quality loans, not really being honest about how low quality they were, and just selling it through and then making huge commissions on the sales. And it also examines the crazy nightlife side of Wall Street in that period before that whole meltdown happened and things got a little bit more right-sized on Wall Street with regard to at least sales and trading. So that was a really fun book. I was living in New York City at the time, and I knew a number of people who worked on Wall Street, and some worked at those banks that were very involved in putting together those financial, real estate-backed products. And it was interesting. Some people, Nelson's getting a lot of airtime here, but he had a great line to me because he wrote The Gold Coast, which was set on the north shore of Long Island. And it was sort of a social satire. And there were a number of people who were upset. They thought they were characters in the book who were not represented well. And he said, I wish I had a nickel for everyone who thought they were a character in one of my books. And because I was living in New York and I knew a lot of people who worked on Wall Street and wrote a book about Wall Street, a number of people were like, there was huge speculation of so-and-so is that person and this person is that. No one had anything right. No one was anyone in the book. It was all amalgamations and, inspired by stories. Some of the stories I had heard might be even worse than what are in the book. But there was a lot of chatter about who was a character in the book. But it also, I guess if I learned something from the book, it is about, prioritizing what you want to get out of life. So the main character is making great money, but his marriage and his life goals outside of money are really suffering, and he needs to sort of reprioritize how he's going to spend his time. And that was something that was worthwhile for me to sort of rethink in my own way, having just made a similar career switch.
Did you study like the markets during that time when you were looking at it, or is it just more about the people and the human aspects of it?
I did research everything. So I would say it's a character-driven book, and it's about, it's largely about a marriage on Wall Street, and Wall Street is the backdrop for this. But I spent a lot of time researching what actually was going on with that financial crisis. So everything in there is really accurate to what happened. And so that was a lot of primary interviews for the most part with people who were working in the banks and who were experts on the credit default swap prices.
Did you ever see the movie? I mean, it's pretty popular, The Big Short.
Yeah.
I love how
Yeah.
they kind of explained it, where you'd be like in the middle of a scene and then they would stop it and flip to something like whatever.
Yeah. That's sort of
Yeah,
cut. Yeah. For a quick take. Yeah. That was well done.
yeah,
You're like learning something as you go. You're getting a great story. It was like, oh, all right. Now I understand that
yeah,
too.
exactly.
You have written about finance, politics, and elite sports. Which of those worlds disturbs you the most?
Wow. I mean, it's my top three for sure, which is why I picked those as subjects. I guess, the finance thing the financial incentives are really perverted and lead to bad outcomes. The politics books, that one is really about the intersection of politics and media, which has always been fraught, and these days especially so. But I'll say for number one, the third topic, which is our cultural obsession with youth athletics and how that's perverted sports all the way through to the professional leagues. Trophy Son is the name of the novel, and it was actually inspired, if you can believe it, by chess. I was living, as I said, in New York City, and I was picking up our son from kindergarten one day and talking to another parent in the hallway, and they're like, oh yeah, what are you doing this weekend? And they're saying, well, we're going to a chess tournament. And it was going to be a 2-day, each day was a full day at some school cafeteria that was converted over to host a chess tournament. So this poor kindergarten kid was going to be doing 8 hours of chess tournaments Saturday and then 8 more on Sunday. And she's like, well, if you want to be any good, like you got to play chess, 30 hours a week. I'm like, for a kindergartner, this little 5-year-old kid was playing chess at the exclusion of everything else. You couldn't play basketball or whatever. All free time was devoted to chess. And apparently, if you want to be great, that's what you do. And that's a huge change, like not only in my lifetime, but in a fairly narrow window of my adult life. I was in high school in the 80s. This is not how it was. Most kids, almost every kid, at least attempted to play 3 sports, different sport each season. And these days, that's not it. You lock in, you sort of put all your chips behind one sport pretty early on. And what I found as the years went by is that of all the sports, tennis is the most extreme. Even if you're a great lacrosse player or a great hockey player or something, you still finish high school. You play for your team. If you're great at tennis at the age of 12 to 13, you probably are pulled out of school and you're homeschooling, or you go down to one of the voluntary type tennis academies in Florida, and you're on the court 8 hours a day and you do a little bit of studying on the side. So for Trophy Son, I picked tennis as the way in to what's happening with our cultural obsession around this. And it follows the life of a tennis prodigy from early youth all the way through professional experience. And it's sad what happens. It's the title was Trophy Son. My working title early on was Specialized, because you have a very narrow upbringing. Like I would talk to guys, whether you make it to Wimbledon or whether you barely made it to the top 1,000 in the world, and now you're the club pro at like a rackets club somewhere. They might have had the very same experience. Agassi and the other guy, who's the club pro, might have had a very similar experience. In fact, many of these guys played together at voluntary. So their lives from 10 to 18 or 19 looked the same, which meant no high school prom, probably didn't go on a date. Like this one guy I interviewed was a club pro. He was like this 6'2", strapping, super handsome guy, amazing tennis player. He actually beat Federer in the juniors, only he was 3 years older than Federer, which is partly why, but he was a great player. And he's like, to hear this guy say it, like girls would throw themselves at this guy, but he was like, I'm so awkward around girls. Like I never went. Someone asked me to their high school prom because, I'd been down at Bollettieri, but they knew my parents. So I came home and I went, and he was like, it was a disaster. Like I'm such a social idiot because all I've done my whole life is, spend 8 hours a day on a tennis court. So it's, and for what, it's just, and I see it now with every sport. these lacrosse kids are playing lacrosse all summer long, every weekend, all year long. And then, a lot of them might go play in college, but, lacrosse is not going to be a big part of their lives after that. And yet they're, it's all part of, there are a lot of reasons. Some of it is professional leagues, but a big part of it is parents trying to figure out how they're going to get their kid into college. A lot of youth sports right now is just a way to get into school. So anyway, it's a totally fraught, messed up system. Our culture is totally obsessed with it. And I was, with those first three novels, each one was something I was seeing that I kind of wanted to address through fiction, to explore these things that are on my mind, I guess.
My dad and I are smirking because I'm right on the fine line of that with youth hockey with my kids. But this is one of the things I want to say about it. So first of all, I think even when I was playing youth sports, I'm 32 now. When I was playing youth sports, there was nobody doing it like how it's done now. I don't know when or where it happened, where it became. We've talked about this before on the podcast, but it's like the Cold War. It's like, I hear that you're bringing your son 3 times a week, so I'm like, well, we were only going once a week. Now we better start going 3, but we got to catch up, so let's go 4. And then my dad hears that you're going 3 and I'm going 4. He's like, well, Johnny and Susie they're better than our kids, so let's start going 5 times. And it's just spiraled out of control. I think there's such a good thing about.
I mean, meanwhile, the coaches doing the private training are like, this is great.
Yeah.
Like, let's do 7 a week.
Yeah, charging more.
Yeah.
There's something so good, like in my own personal experience with sports, from youth sports all the way through college, where it's like, socially it helped me so much, where I had friends built in, or I had, I made friends because we're around each other so much, and different kids, different backgrounds, different experiences. And also I think like your confidence, especially when you're, from my experience, a young boy, I don't know, I'm sure girls probably the same, but it felt so important for the things outside of sports. And then also, like, it happened to be that I loved the sport and football, and I played all the time and practiced all the time. I watched film, I watched games, and yada, yada, yada. And so my dad and I joke, I'm as close to that line. I'm walking a tightrope of being the crazy guy versus kids loving a sport and supporting it.
Yeah, sports is amazing. That's what makes it so tricky, because I want all my kids to have a varsity experience in high school if they can do it, because you learn discipline and practice equals improvement, and there's teamwork and community, and sometimes having a whole separate group of friends on your team. If the friends at school, everything can be up and down. So it's nice to have a couple different friend communities to pick you up if the other one's not great for whatever reason. And so I love all of that stuff with sports. And how it was back in the 80s for me, I thought was just, I don't know, it turned into a racket to get kids into college at some point along there, I think, is the main driver of where it can sometimes go south. Yeah,
I like to say that you can learn like life's hardest lessons in the controlled, cushy environment of sports. Like, it sucks when you lose the big game, but it's a lot better to learn there than like get fired at a job and if it be your first real loss. And the same thing the other way too, like the positive feedback loop of, like, my son worked really hard on skating specifically for hockey. And then the off season, he wanted to skate. And then we showed back up for the season, and he was a really good skater compared to the kids that didn't do it. And now he's like, oh, I could do that in everything. Like, I want to learn the alphabet. I want to learn how to read. I want to learn, it's like, it's just like a really, just like positive feedback loops too, that you can get from sports.
That's amazing. Yeah. Like just seeing the hard work pay off, like one season to the next. That's a great, I can outwork these guys.
Yeah. It's fun. And then I think I do like doing other sports and other things like that too, because for all the things you're saying, it's different kids, it's different skills, it's different ways to use your brain, it's all that stuff. But I'm deep in my kids are 7, 5, 3, and 1, so I'm deep in the youth sports circuit right now.
Ice hockey's a tough one. A lot of gear, a lot of driving around, a lot of bad smelling gear.
Yeah, it's nuts. But we're having so far. It's been so fun, like for the whole family. Like my other kids watching their sibling, and it's just been great.
Yeah, that's all. Well, the other great thing is you have a shot clock at least. Those baseball games, like a double header, that can be forever.
Yeah, yeah,
At least you've got like the horn goes, and you're like, all right, we're out.
yeah. I think too. Tennis is one that I think. Remember, there was that documentary. I think it was called like The Side Door or something. It was talking about the people using sports and influence and stuff like that to get into these universities, and they would say like, there's the front door, there's the back door, and we're using the side door. I think it was mostly about kind of political and like payment things, but they were using like more. I don't want to say tennis is an obscure sport, but it's not as popular as like so people, these like politicians or actors and actresses, their kids would do like, oh, we're on the rowing team, and then they'd not really have ever rown before. And that I think like you're saying, I think it's been more of a college thing, which is crazy when you're thinking about whatever.
I think I know the scandal you're talking about. There was some famous actress.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like a Stanford
Full
rowing
House,
coach had,
right? Yeah.
could get one kid in or something like that. So for the right amount of, I remember that story. Yeah.
It's like around that time where it started, all of a sudden you heard about people being like, oh no, we're really going to focus on rowing. And I'm like, rowing? Where could rowing possibly come in? Oh, it's great for the Ivies or something like that.
A lot of your work is about people chasing success and losing something on the way. When has that been true in your own life?
I mean, the thing that keeps coming back is every career option has a trade-off. We've touched on this earlier with writing. I do miss the entrepreneurship and the camaraderie. It is still isolating. One nice thing about when the book is out and I go do book tour, I get to meet you guys and sort of do the running around for a few weeks, maybe do a few events at bookstores and literary festivals and sort of get them out amongst the people. But for me, writing narrative history, I have a book out every 3 years or so. And so in between those 3 year, book tours, it's sort of back to the office. And it is a different lifestyle. Like one of the adjustments I had to make, that I talked about the book club I started with other writers, that was part of it. But I don't really go to an office. So one of the adjustments was creating like a work from home environment that could work. And, how do you stay motivated when there's not, an office to be to every day and a commute to make and a sort of a change of environment. Working from home can actually be kind of tricky, to stay motivated and to stay disciplined. And then also sort of filling up your social time. You don't want to just turn into like a recluse. So it did take some work beyond just, a couple of those things. Like I try to keep up with friends and, force myself to schedule time to get out and see people or, take meetings with my editor and agent and stuff like that. So it was a very dramatic shift in leaving the corporate world behind to become a writer and not, let too many parts of myself just sort of wither.
When you first heard the Rudolph Diesel story, what was the detail that made you think the official version did not make sense?
The Rudolph Diesel story, I did come in through the mystery of the disappearance. And, I saw this list of just disappearances at sea, and then I was like, wait, I wonder if that's the engine guy. I just bought a diesel engine for a boat. And then it really wasn't any one particular detail. It was just the accumulation of dozens that made no sense. And, after the next, I'm like, this is impossible. This story makes no sense. All of these things add up to it having to be something else. Like he left his hat and coat on the rail of the ship, and he, left this bag for his wife, and the number of he went to the museum and donated all his things right before he left, but then he wrote this, and then a newspaper article says he's over here, or the people on the passenger ferry say he got off and didn't get back on the ship. So by the time you've read 12 or 15 or more of these, you're like, okay, this is really any one of them would raise an eyebrow, but the accumulation was really persuasive for me.
You challenged the idea that Diesel simply killed himself. When you are pushing against the accepted story, how do you keep yourself from seeing only what you want to see?
Well, when I came into it, I didn't have a conclusion. I was open-minded to all possibilities. The the largely accepted story is suicide, but a number of theories were explored early on. So when I went into it, I was like, well, let's see what it is, and then read all the newspaper accounts, all the secondary research on it, and then so it wasn't like I came to it trying to put it in a box. I kind of reviewed everything and came to a conclusion based on that. And it's came to it as the only conclusion that makes sense. Like once you really collect all the different data points on what happened at that time, it was the only outcome that made sense.
Rudolf Diesel believed his engine could help mankind, but it became tied to war, oil, and power. What does that tell you about inventors and the things they create?
Yeah, that was one of the crazy ironies for Diesel. He had this amazing list that he wrote in 1883, more than a decade before he released the diesel engine, of the intended uses for it. And what he had hoped to do was create a small, compact power source for decentralized economies, for craftsmen, out in the suburbs, like dentistry and woodworking and things like that, rather than to be the power source for centralized kind of like the big factories in the cities. That were using steam engines that were the size of a room, these massive steam engines with boilers of water and chimney stacks and all of that. So he thought, I'm gonna build an engine for everyone else. And of course, it didn't work out that way. As you say, it became the engine of war and big industry. It became the big business engine. And what it says, and we see this a lot, is that the inventor is often not the decisive factor in how the invention is used. Diesel wanted it to go this way, but there are many stakeholders in determining which technologies win out and how these technologies are used. And the source, the Rockefeller, for example, as the main source of petroleum and the fuel for the engine, he's a factor. The governments and the militaries are a factor in where the engine's going to get used. And so we've seen that, throughout history, things maybe start as a military technology, they make their way to civilian, but it's often the inventor builds something and then many other factors in the market determine how it gets used. And that was the case with diesel. He certainly didn't have submarines on his 1883 list of uses for the diesel engine, and yet it became the only engine that could satisfy use in a submarine, and therefore, put diesel right at the heart of the Anglo-German naval arms race.
So I'm going to be honest here, Doug. I don't know about his disappearance or the end of his life. So what's the back of the napkin version of the story?
Well, if I can give it away if you want, but I'll set it up. So really the setup of what happened to his disappearance is the setup for the whole book, because it follows a couple different threads, including Kaiser Wilhelm II, Rockefeller and Standard Oil in America, and diesel and the emergence of his engine. And when he disappeared right before World War I, September 29, 1913, he's leaving Belgium for Great Britain on an overnight passenger ferry, and he disappears in the night. And while we largely don't know the name today, although maybe after the book, his name's getting a little bit out there, but we know, you pass the word diesel every day at a filling station or train, ship, whatever. But many people don't know that there was a Rudolf Diesel who invented the diesel engine. But when he disappeared, he actually was a global celebrity. So when he went missing in September of 1913, the following morning, it was headlines in every newspaper around the world, from Russia all through Western Europe out to the New York Times. It was the main headline in the New York Times that the great inventor Diesel is missing. And within days, there were a number of different theories. At first, they thought, well, maybe he fell overboard, but it was a calm night. There was no wind or waves or anything like that. Then there was a theory of maybe murder. One being because Diesel was cooperating quite a bit with the British. In fact, he designed these secret sketches of diesel-powered battleships and submarines that were designed by an engineer of the Britain's Royal Navy. But it was in the middle of the heated Anglo-German arms race. We're right on the eve of World War I. So there was speculation that because he was traveling to Great Britain to establish a new diesel engine manufacturing company that was going to build diesels for the Royal Navy submarine program, there was speculation in some newspapers that Kaiser Wilhelm and the Germans had killed him. There was also speculation that he was killed by agents of big oil, because diesel, from the founding of the engine, had been advocating that the engine run on peanut or vegetable oil rather than petroleum. And he won the 1900, just years before, he won the 1900 Paris World's Fair on a diesel engine running nut oil. And he'd been traveling around America just 1 year before, saying, I can break the American petroleum monopoly, and I don't need a law like the Antitrust Act to do it. I can do it with the power of the diesel engine. So I can break the petrol. So some people thought, all right, well, Rockefeller's behind this because diesel's, a threat to that. And then the other theory was that he actually just committed suicide because he had gone bankrupt. He'd made a bunch of terrible investments. And he had made some bad investments. But I also, there were a number of opportunities for him to make lots more money. He'd been just in the prior year, he'd been offered jobs by Henry Ford, he'd been by Baldwin Railroad, as well as a number of companies in Europe. So even if he had sort of taken his accounts to zero with bad investments, he had tons of opportunity. He'd never been at a higher level of celebrity and demand for his expertise. So he could have made a new fortune at any time. So anyway, I don't know if you want me to give I have a conclusion.
Yeah, give it a spoiler.
What happens with Rudolf Diesel that I present in the book, and I go through sort of a whole analysis. I mean, largely the book is his life and all these different political and military forces and how the diesel engine's right at the heart of all of it. I mean, it's been the main power source in the world for more than 100 years. Even to this day, every ship, larger than a private passenger craft with outboards, they're all diesel. Every cargo ship in the world is diesel. Everything on the road larger than a passenger car, all the trucks are all diesel still. And then, of course, for submarines in World War I and II, it was all diesel.
Yeah, you got to give your theory now. We can't. For anyone who's going to read the book, skip this part.
Okay, go mute if you have not yet read it, because it's an eye-popping conclusion. But there's a lot of evidence that he was working very closely with the British, and the conclusion I have is that he did work with Churchill's Royal Navy. This is a classic Churchill kind of a play, that he actually defected and he got involved with a submarine development program in Canada. And there is some evidence that he was in Canada after the disappearance. There's some newspaper reporting that he was actually there, where Churchill put together this rush, top secret submarine development program in Canada that delivered a number of subs to the war effort in record time, all diesel engines. Even Canada didn't know that this factory had been set up. The Canadian government, they were basically a colony of Great Britain at this time. But the Royal Navy went in there and set up this whole thing. Even the Canadians didn't know, and they built a bunch of diesel subs. And there was weird reporting that diesel was spotted in Canada at this time. So,
that's awesome.
And his wife was back in Germany, and she had been writing to someone in Canada. But it's all in there. It's like there's a ton of amazing stuff that kind of strings together.
Your latest book, The Lost Empire of Emmanuel Nobel, is about a man who helped shape the modern world but was almost erased from history. When did you realize this was not just a forgotten business story, but a story about Russia, power, and the world we still live in?
Doug, before you answer, let's go the other way this time. I don't know anything about this like you two do. Give me the quick explanation first before you answer, so any other listener knows, rather than just explaining.
Quick overview of Emmanuel Nobel.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
Why him? What made you write the book?
I first learned about Emmanuel Nobel. He's the nephew of Alfred Nobel. So we all know Alfred Nobel as the inventor of dynamite, and he established the Nobel Prize. his nephew is Emmanuel, and there was he was the head of the family of Nobels living in Russia, which we know much less about, yet they had done far more. He was a much bigger industrialist even than Alfred, and he established the whole Russian oil industry in southern Russia, along the Caspian Sea, what was then part of the Russian Empire. It's now modern day Azerbaijan. And in the north of Russia, he had a huge munitions and engine factory near St. Petersburg. And so he was business partners with Rudolf Diesel, which is how I came across Emmanuel Nobel in the first place. He had the license for the diesel engine in the Russian Empire and became one of the world's leading manufacturers of diesel engines. He was building for the Russian Navy and Army and to pump oil in his wells down in southern Russia. So he was this huge figure, and yet we don't really know much about him. His father had first bought land in the Caspian in the 1870s. He died. Emmanuel took over the business in 1888. At that time, it was pretty big, but not massive. Over the next 12 years, by 1900, he had built an oil empire larger than Standard Oil. It was the biggest oil producer in the world. Same thing, by the time the World War I started in 1914, he was the largest oil producer in the world, and yet we don't really know anything about him, and it's because nearby in Georgia, the country of Georgia, Joseph Stalin was born. And when these two collided in 1917 and the Russian Revolution, what Lenin and Stalin and the Bolsheviks did to Nobel at the time of the Russian Revolution was the inspiration for George Orwell's 1984. They completely erased his history. All the street names are torn down. There's a scene in 1984 that talks about this. They tore down the street names, they ripped down the statues, and they rewrote the history. And Nobel's petroleum company was renamed the Soviet Petroleum Company. His machine factory up in the north was renamed Ruski Diesel. And so the West really doesn't know much about the story of Emmanuel Nobel, even though he was the far bigger industrialist of the Nobel family.
You say the collision between Emmanuel Nobel and Joseph Stalin helped create the world we live in today. What do you mean by that?
Russia had been going along this path of reform, repress. And, they went from one of the most autocratic, almost Eastern, like in the way that in Japan, the emperor is almost godlike. The Tsar was almost godlike. He was God's representative on earth. So he was even more than just a king. And they were trying to reform things a little bit. Like in 1861, Alexander II, Tsar Alexander II, freed the serfs. And he did that a couple years even before Lincoln freed the slaves in America. And he was introducing liberal reforms around freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. And that actually opened the door for the sort of organization of subversive groups that were preaching Marxist theory. And so years later, some of these groups actually succeeded in assassinating Alexander II. The very sort of freedoms that he permitted kind of snapped back around, and these groups assassinated him. When his son took over, he implemented he's like, we're rolling all this stuff back. All those nice things my dad was going to do, it's over. We're rolling all that back. And so then they went through a period of repression. It's a cycle that Russia repeats. We say history is like just repeats itself. Same thing of, Gorbachev into Putin. Gorbachev was sort of liberalizing things, and then, Soviets collapse and Putin comes in and said, we're rolling all that back, and then it's repressive again. So Russia has been through that same cycle many times. When the Great War broke out, they had a very ineffectual leader in Tsar Nicholas II. And there were a number of things undermining his rule, including Rasputin, who features prominently in the book. He's just such a wacky character, the crazy monk Rasputin, who became friendly with the Tsar and Tsarina, but really undermined their credibility of rule. And as the war was going very badly for Russia, Nicholas II actually took over the army. He replaced his general. He said, I'm going to run the army now, which left no distance between him and the ruler. So when things actually started going even worse for the army, people blamed the Tsar directly. He used to have someone else he could at least point to. And so his rule eventually just became untenable. Even his generals said, look, you're going to have to abdicate. Things are crumbling. So the Tsar is out of there. There's the February Revolution. He's out. But they actually have a sort of democratic government that takes over. The provisional government was a largely democratic body, and Russia was still poised to kind of pull itself together. And the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Stalin, had almost no support. They were one of the least popular of all the political groups. They were one of the most extreme, but they had very little support, far less than the socialist revolutionaries, than the Mensheviks, than even people who wanted the Tsar back. And it was really just through sort of a narrow window that they were able to take over. And they acted very decisively in October. And so Nobel was still the leading industrialist in all of the Russian Empire at this time, still controls all the oil. And he's now like kind of in the targets of Stalin and Lenin, who take over in October of 17. And Lenin, who's very familiar with southern Russia, Stalin had actually worked in the oil fields of Nobel and Rothschild, encourages Lenin to nationalize all of the oil infrastructure in southern Russia, to nationalize, just take over Nobel's business, which he does. And so Nobel's sort of in hiding in southern Russia, like behind a little buffer of the White Army. Stalin's in Moscow saying, we need you to come help us pump the oil. And this collision between the two kind of sets, it's whether the Bolsheviks are going to survive really depends on whether or not they can get their hands on Nobel's oil.
It's so funny hearing this stuff. It sounds like something that is, must be from hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years ago, and it's like, it really, in the big picture, it was not that long ago at all. It was like a lifetime ago.
It is. And there was, when Nobel was basically a refugee in 1919, Balfour is the foreign minister for Great Britain who's in Versailles, and they're wrapping up what's going to happen with the Great War. They're trying to figure out all the terms of the peace. And this is all while the Russian Civil War is happening. The Red Army of the communists is fighting the White Army, who wants to have the Tsar back. And Nobel writes a letter to Balfour and says, the Red Army, Stalin and the Red Army, they're coming for Baku, where all the oil is. This is in the spring of 1919. And he said, they're going to get here by August. If he doesn't get here by August, they're going to be out of oil, and the Red Army is going to collapse. They'll just choke out for lack of oil. And the British were holding Baku at the time, but they had a small force of about 1,000 people. And Nobel said, you need to reinforce your position there. Otherwise, Stalin's going to get there and take over the oil, and then it's going to be very difficult to defeat him. And Balfour didn't do it. And Churchill was arguing the same thing that Nobel was, saying with 100,000 troops, we can send 100,000 troops into Russia and we can nip this whole communist thing in the bud. And it'll never happen. But there was no appetite for sending more troops into Russia. Britain had just fought this 4-year war where tons of people had been killed and they'd spent so much money. They were in debt. They hadn't spent anything on social programs. So Churchill and Nobel could not convince Britain to send more troops. And things happened exactly as Nobel predicted. Stalin and the Red Army did get to Baku, and they did take over the oil. But had they listened to Nobel or Churchill at that time, we might have had a 20th century in which communism never appears. That, it had never existed anywhere in the world until Lenin put it into place in 1918. And if it had been nipped in the bud, there would have been no communist Russia, China, Korea, Cuba, Vietnam. None of it would have happened. And it's only by the narrowest window that it did.
The Soviets tried to erase or distort much of the Nobel family's legacy. What was the hardest part of putting Emmanuel Nobel's story back together?
Just gathering enough about his personality. I knew a lot of the facts about the business. I could get company records for how much oil they produced and when they developed the world's first oil tanker. And I actually could get the blueprint sketches of the tanker they designed. So a lot of that stuff was available. But I was trying to really round out his person. And that took a little more work, finding many letters and firsthand accounts about him from friends and family. He didn't have any kids, so there aren't, like great grandkids around today to sort of tell the stories. But there was a lot of archival material. A lot of it was pulled out of Azerbaijan. after communism fell. And there's a lot in Stockholm. A lot of the Nobel family stuff, when Nobel finally did get out of Russia, he returned to Stockholm, which is where the Nobels are originally from. And all the Nobel Prize stuff is still there. So there's a huge amount of Nobel family stuff. A lot of it's on Alfred and the prizes, but there's a huge amount as well on the Russian Nobels, Emmanuel and his side of the family. So you could find old letters and diary entries of things and lots of old photographs with captions and things like that. And sort of family lore of the gift giving. He was sort of a practical joker too. And he was also very into the arts. He was the largest customer of Fabergé outside of the Tsar. And he designed these different jewels. And if you had a big banquet, when husbands and wives would come over, every wife at the table in her napkin, there'd be a little piece of Fabergé jewelry and things like that. So you start to get to know him over many years of reading all the documents. But I think sort of bringing him into the book as sort of a three-dimensional character on the page was the most difficult piece.
The Nobel family built an empire that rivaled Rockefeller's Standard Oil. What did they understand about technology and business that other people missed?
One of the things that gave the Nobel family a huge advantage when they first got down to Baku in southern Russia in the Caucasus was it was so backward there. It was like this ancient land, but it had such abundant petroleum. It's the same area that's known in the mythology of Jason and the Argonauts. Like it still looked like an ancient land. It was the land of the eternal flame, where there's gas seeping from fissures in the rock that could ignite, and so you had this eternal flame. There was so much petroleum in the ground that it was literally bubbling on the surface. But there was no technology for drilling. People were skimming it off these surface puddles and using the petroleum as like a lubricant, things like that. Or if they were digging for oil, it was just with shovels. And when they first got there in 1873, that was still the case. It still looked kind of like an ancient land. But it was 3 years after the founding of Standard Oil, which had been founded in 1870 in America. And Rockefeller had established a playbook for how to drill, refine, develop a network of pipelines and railroads and distribute the oil. So the Nobels had a lot of technical expertise from all of their work building munitions and engines and other things up in St. Petersburg. So they took all their engineering expertise and their capital, and they copied the Rockefeller playbook and brought that down to Baku and built, high-tech drilling operations and refining operations. They installed their own pipelines in the way that Rockefeller had in America to move the oil. And then they even surpassed Rockefeller by building the world's first oil tanker. And suddenly they're shipping oil overseas to international markets, and really actually surprised Rockefeller with their ability to distribute in that way. So they really they sort of found themselves in a great advantage. One of the reasons why it had been so backward up until that time in 1873, when they first bought land, was some of the policies of the Tsar. And we talked a little bit about the Tsar trying to liberalize things and become a little bit more business oriented. In the old days under the Tsar, all the land was sort of on a 4-year rolling lease. So you could lease something from the Tsar, because the Tsar basically owned all the land, but you could lease it for 4 years and run your business. But at the end of the 4 years, you may or may not get a renewal of your lease. So no one was really willing to build or invest in a lot of infrastructure in that land if it's just going to get yanked from underneath them. And then in 1873, they changed the law that you could actually buy and own the land, which would incentivize investment in infrastructure. And that's when the Nobels showed up. So they bought land and they did invest. But it's one of the reasons why there really hadn't been much at all prior to their showing up.
I know it's impossible to know this, but just because you studied him and probably know of him better than 99.9% of the world, if he was alive today, being such a successful and great businessman, what industry do you think, like if he was, a young man kind of starting out, what industry do you think he would be looking at?
Gosh, I mean, it could still be oil, right? I mean, if you pick up the paper today and turn to any page, the more things change, the more they stay the same. We're still like figuring things out in the Middle East and opening up straits so oil can get through. I mean, it was the story of the times in World War I, and it remains the story of our times, how we capture sources of energy. So I think he would be in the energy business, or maybe AI, or a data center. But he definitely would be thinking big, wouldn't be small.
You describe Emmanuel Nobel as a very different kind of leader from Stalin. What did Nobel do that made his workers trust him?
He was, I think, in general, a benevolent person, but I think he also recognized the pragmatism in being a benevolent employer. And in Baku, the working conditions were dismal. People lived in horrible conditions. The working conditions were not only dismal, but dangerous. A lot of people died in the oil fields, out on the rigs, and in the refining operations. And Nobel was a very different leader in that sense. And this was observed by international people who came through Baku, and they wrote articles about how differently he ran his business. He built schools, employee housing, hospitals. He built infrastructure for leisure time activities. Like there was like a sort of a form of bowling games and other things for the employees to do. And it made the employees happy and feel pride in their work. They called themselves Nobelites. That was the place you wanted to work in southern Russia. And so when there were worker uprisings, and Stalin was always down there agitating workers to strike and have insurrections. When those kind of events happened, and there was a lot of sabotage to oil rigs and refineries, Nobel always got off relatively easy. His workers actually protected him rather than strike and cause sabotage. They would say, no, this is one of the good guys. This is not the capitalist pig we need to be revolting against. Other oil owners, like the Rothschilds, were the next biggest oil concern in southern Russia, the famous investment family. And the Rothschilds are Jewish, too. And so they actually got it much worse in terms of sabotage. And then when the main revolution happened and Emmanuel needed to escape and the communists are taking over, it was his employees who actually stepped in and really assisted him in escaping Russia. Just as every other population of workers is grabbing their former bosses and throwing them into a kangaroo court and then murdering them. It was the opposite for Nobel. He'd been such an enlightened, kind employer that his employees were loyal to him in return. And when they could have strung him up, they actually protected him.
I wonder how different it would be if Churchill had sent the troops.
Amazing, right? One of the other reasons why Churchill and the British ultimately didn't send the troops was no one believed the Bolsheviks would succeed. Even as late as 1919, most people were thinking Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky, these guys have never run anything in their lives, let alone this massive empire. And within months or weeks, they'll fail, and there's no need to send troops because they're going to fall on their face anyway. So it's not a problem we need to solve. And they were wrong.
Just a power, a vacuum, right? A void in the power of, I don't know. It seems like that's something that I never heard about till today, and it's like, what a turning point in world history. Just one small decision. And it's not a small decision. 100,000 is a lot of troops, but doable.
Small in the grand scheme of what they just went through with World War I.
Yeah.
It's not a lot relative to what they'd been through, but it had been so much. Everyone was so relieved when that war was finally wrapped up. No one thought when World War I broke out, both sides were the saying was we'll be home by Christmas. When it started in August of 14, we all thought they'd be home by Christmas of 14.
That kind of leadership feels rare now. Emmanuel Nobel believed business could be done in a more humane way. What do you think he understood that a lot of people missed?
I think one of the things Nobel grasped was the benefits of working with the employees and getting their buy-in to the success of the firm. It's something he wrote about as well. Rather than, I don't want to use the wrong word here, but rather than really, forcing them to work, he wanted them to want to be a part of it. So he was much more in favor of, the concept of employee ownership and, being a part of the success rather than forcing them to be a success. So whenever there were worker grievances, he sat down with them and tried to work it out. And it's actually one of the ironies that he recognized when Stalin was fomenting agitation. he recognized when there were professional agitators there, and he actually wrote this back to his board of investors, like, these guys aren't here to resolve grievances. They're here to start a fight. They don't want to get to a solution. What they want is a revolution. They're looking to actually, which is exactly right. That's what Stalin wanted. He didn't want piecemeal gains or like concessions or meeting halfway. He was like, no, the only way that Bolshevism is going to succeed is through, blood and fire. We need a war. So anytime the other side was giving him an inch, that's actually not what he wanted.
You have said we cannot understand Putin without understanding Russian history. What does Emmanuel Nobel's story help us see about Russia today?
One of the things that's so interesting about the Russian people that we sometimes forget, people in the West sometimes forget, is that their history and their whole style of rule is actually more close to like Asian. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but the Tsar was more than just a ruler. He was sort of a demigod. And the Russian people have been long used to like very firm autocratic rule. And so when Putin comes in, it's a different mentality, a different mindset of the people. And one of the early czars, I think it was Nicholas I, who was advising Alexander II. There's so many, going back, but this is really in the early 1800s. And he was advising his son on how he needs to prepare himself to lead Russia. And he was saying that, Napoleon would say that, sometimes you're the lamb, sometimes you're the lion. And, you need to be flexible as a leader to sort of finesse things with your people and bring them along. And he was basically saying to his son, that's fine for Western Europe. That doesn't work in Russia. In Russia, you can be only the lion. And that kind of played out every time they tried to liberalize things. Anytime he tried a little flexibility, I'll be the lamb for a little bit. I'm going to allow freedom of assembly, then they get assassinated. And then the only thing harder than, introducing the reforms is rolling them back. Then when the son comes in and he's going to turn, then, there are many assassination attempts on him. And so just through their history, they're much more Eastern Asian in terms of thinking of, like a Japanese emperor. Russia's a little closer to that historically than they are to the West.
I was going to say, do you think that there's anything, like it seems like Putin's running that same playbook, right? Just always be the lion. As he gets older and maybe faces his own eventual mortality, like do you think that there's any chance that he goes the other way, or do you think he's this way all the way through?
I suspect all the way through. I'm less an expert on present day Russia, but I have heard speculation that he can never relinquish power because then he'll be too vulnerable and almost certainly be assassinated by someone who then absorbs the power. Like the minute he lets go of the power, someone will take him out. So he has to stay in there until the very end.
It's such a vicious cycle, right?
Totally. It's crazy.
You write a lot about public power and private cost. You are married to someone with a very public life, but you have kept a more private identity. Has that been difficult?
No, it's not. Every author has to have a little bit of social media out there. Our publishers demand it. You have to be on Twitter and Instagram to try to sell books. So that's pretty much the extent of what I do, and do some talks like this as well, which are a lot of fun. But no, it hasn't been hard, really. I mean, it's as much as you want it to be and as little as you want it to be.
I have found a lot of stability in my own life through faith in Jesus, and I'm always interested in how others think about it. Has faith, in whatever form it takes for you, shaped how you think about success, family, or death?
We're raising our kids Catholic. I was raised Presbyterian. I wasn't that devout growing up, but we're going more. We're pretty much every Sunday at church. And so we wanted to raise our kids with that and give them that experience. I think that faith and religion is a great way to register information, to sort of register the information you get in the world. and it's always a great reset. I look for it in the same way I look forward to getting to my office and sitting down and working and creating and writing. I love that time. I love our time on Sunday mornings. It's a great, almost meditative reset for me. Sort of capping off one week and then thinking forward into the next week, and sort of checking in with myself and my sort of on a spiritual side. So we've prioritized that with our kids, and hoping that it'll stick as an important part of their lives.
Before we close, I always ask our guests to brag about their families. Doug, please go ahead.
He really does. You're not the only person. It's every guest, so won't be the first guy doing it and look like that guy here.
Okay. Well, we have a family text thread. This actually gets back to the book. So the dedication of the book is to the core five. We have 3 kids, so there are 5 of us, and our family text thread is the core 5. It's an active text thread. It's all, even if you see something funny online, or take a quick picture of a beautiful sunrise or sunset or whatever, it's multiple times a day that text thread is firing, and it's great. I'll say that one of the many unifying things for us is everyone has a great sense of humor, and it sort of brings us all together. And we also prioritize. Our kids are young now, but we still are able to get together for dinner. As busy as they're teenagers, really, and things get pretty busy even for teenagers, as you know, with all the activities. But I would say we're together for dinner probably 6 nights a week. We have to sort of move it around. Sometimes it's at 6, sometimes it's at 8, but we make it happen, and that's been really important.
That's awesome. That's been something my dad's done since we were little. It was always a joke that like my friends would be like, "Oh, we're going to Troy's house. We're going to be, it's a family dinner night," and they would be like in the family dinner. So that's fun. I also too, Doug, I got to give one shout out to your wife Megan. She did, when my dad came out publicly that he had ALS. She did like tweet out support and say like fellow Syracuse and all that stuff. So that was really cool.
Oh, that's great. Okay, I didn't know that. Thank you for pointing that out. What you were Syracuse undergrad?
Yeah, my dad played at Syracuse and then went to Syracuse Law School, and I actually did too. But yeah, he did a lot more successfully, both in football and academically, than I did. But yeah, and now we live in the area. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Meg she bleeds orange, and she was teaching aerobics for extra money on the side, and I think she knew that Daryl Johnson went to Syracuse, right?
Yeah.
Didn't he play football there?
Yeah, him and my dad are friends.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I just saw him at SiriusXM. I don't really know him, but I did see him to say hello some months ago. He was at the SiriusXM offices. And but Meg was doing aerobics instruction, and the head lacrosse coach passed by, and the lacrosse team's great there at Syracuse and always has been. And he's like, "I need you to like whip my boys into shape." So there was a period of time there where she was doing like an aerobics class, and the whole lacrosse team is like getting their workout from her doing the aerobics. This would have been somewhere in the 80s, but great school.
Now on to our final word segment, where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
4-way tie between wedding and 3 babies coming along.
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
My dad's illness.
What are you most excited about?
Our next family trip.
What advice would you give your younger self?
Start writing sooner.
Do you have any book recommendations for us or for the listeners?
Well, in addition to The Lost Empire of Emmanuel Nobel and Rudolf Diesel, I love Rules of Civility by Amor Towles for fiction. And for nonfiction, I'll say The Zimmerman Telegram by Barbara Tuchman. It's a pre-World War I book.
The name of our podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything you want to say?
This has been awesome. I love this whole format. This show is great. It's great to meet you guys both, and I love the father-son team. I hope that this is inspiring me to grab one of my kids and go do some sort of endeavor like this. I really have loved it.
Yeah, it's so fun. So I'm going to ask you the real last question now is, at the end of every podcast, we always ask our guests, who are a couple of people that you know personally, and now you got to know us a little bit, that you think we should have on the show for a future episode?
C.J. Box, do you know that? He's a novelist. He's a great guy, really good writer. Lee Child, another great writer, would be great. Most of the guys I know are writers, so
Yeah.
I'm going to be writer centric. You guys probably have more of a broad mix, but I'll say, and Jennifer Egan, another great writer.
Doug, thank you for joining us. Your work asks people to look again at the stories they thought they already understood, and at the cost of ambition, invention, power, and being remembered. We appreciate your time, your research, and your willingness to talk about the life behind the books. May God bless you and your family.
Thank you so much, guys. This was so much fun. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks, Doug.